Ani Bojo, everybody. My name is Bailey Walkie. I'm the Youth Policy Analyst at the Aboriginal Housing Management Association. But today I'm joining you as the founder of Frayed Feathers, an Indigenous youth-led consultancy business that solves collaboration challenges for teams creating Indigenous responses. So, before I jump into the podcast, which is going to be talking about the ultimate advocacy position, which is what I do currently as an Indigenous social policy analyst. I want to give a quick life update for like the three people who care. I got married. I think I look pretty spiff in the tux, so I'll definitely be keeping it. I honeymooned in Japan. That's where I got this lovely bow tie, and I'm just so happy about it. Not the bow tie, but just honeymooning and having a great relationship with my wife. Almost said fiance. And yeah, I felt like the wedding and more importantly the wedding reception, because that's like the best part, let's be honest. I really felt like rewarded for all like the meaningful relationships my partner and I have built over the years. Kind of just one of those things where there was just so many people meeting for the first time. Some people coming from Ontario, which is where I'm from. We had obviously made friends here, friends from our childhood who are coming in, who don't live in Ontario or British Columbia. And yeah, like everybody was dancing, having a good time, like the drinks were flowing, people were happy. And yeah, all in all, like nothing felt forced. And I just love everything about our wedding reception. So I'm really happy. I'm ecstatic. And of course, looking forward to forever being able to use the excuse of I need to check in with my wife. So now with the life updates out of the way, I have started a newsletter, a Frayed Feathers newsletter. You can find it in the description. This is going to be launching on November 4th. That's pretty cool. And this is really just a way for me to share more long-form content, like articles, as well as providing commentary. Like I'll be developing the articles. I read all the reports. I get media scans every single morning about Indigenous youth reconciliation. I'm very engaged, and really this newsletter is a way for me to bring that, all those kind of linkages into a newsletter for people to benefit from. In nonprofit, you're almost always going to be serving Indigenous people because there's such a vast need out there. So I highly recommend subscribing to the newsletter and receiving that value for free. So lastly, as far as order of business, I am restarting the podcast. I know it's been 4 months, and that's kind of the reason why I also got this tux on. I feel like I fully understand what goes into a podcast now. Like I was able to film the podcast, but I wasn't really able to deliver it in a way that was like up to my standards. Excuse me. Standards meaning like I could do the podcast, but like I wasn't taking into account all the extra things you need to do, like writing a good description, chaptering your notes, including closed caption, creating a thumbnail, all those things. Like I have no design experience, right? So like I'm learning all these things as I go. And so I feel like now I have an opportunity to restart it, be way more consistent about it. I'm going to be releasing these on Tuesday morning. It's actually Sunday right now, which just goes to prove like the difference. I was recording it like the day of, like before, like, which is honestly looking back was bananas. And so anyway, you didn't come here for any of that, but what you did come here is to learn about the ultimate advocacy position. So let me break it down for you. I am a youth policy analyst, okay? I work in the nonprofit sector, or the public sector, as some may call it, and I work for a housing association, okay? Now, being a policy analyst, that's a position that can go in so many different directions. You don't need to be working in the same position or same sector that I am. I would say policy analysts like span all sectors, to be honest. Yeah, it's just like there's always policy, there's always legislation that regulates things, and therefore there will always be a need for policy analysts to be spread about in these different positions. And so just to provide some context there, and my secondary goal to this podcast is to unpack what I've learned and how my role changes as a policy analyst based on the phase of the project. Like phase meaning like the timeline, right? Like are we in the needs assessment phase? Are we in the research phase? Are we in the successful grant proposal phase, like where we've received money? At all those different points in a project, my role as a policy analyst changes. And so I want to provide a fulsome picture to that, in addition to then kind of like working my way into Frayed Feathers and explaining the value of Frayed Feathers and like solving collaboration challenges for teams to create Indigenous responses. So let's go into it. So a little bit about my role, like my level of expertise. So I've been working as a policy analyst for 3 years, and I currently lead the development of an Indigenous youth housing strategy for the Aboriginal Housing Management Association. And so to best understand my role, I created a little, well, I just wrote some stuff on a board. Look at that. How cute is that? All right. So look, so basically, yeah, BC Housing at the top, okay? They are a crown corporation. Crown corporations exist for many, many reasons. And so anyway, if you see this little green thing here, so basically, BC Housing gives the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, or AMA for short, operational dollars, okay? Operational means like, since we are a housing association, we have members, and those members are Indigenous nonprofit housing providers, unsurprisingly. And so basically what our function is BC Housing gives us operational dollars, and then we give those dollars to the nonprofit Indigenous housing providers. And so what's great about that is that, we talk so much about how like Indigenous representation is so important. We talk about, coming to a level of understanding with Indigenous values and business goals, right? Like trying to balance them and stuff. And so, maybe a little biased because I work there, but I do feel like AMA, they try to do the best they can to how would I say, like kind of like embody that Indigenous way of knowing, right? And like operating and like doing business and things like this, right? So that's no knock on BC Housing, but it's just that, if you could be supported by an Indigenous organization that does the same function, but like they also understand you more, well, like why not, right? And so, and just like FYI, like not everybody goes through this stream. Sometimes people skip AMA and they just go straight to BC Housing, you know what I mean? And like they have that relationship, and that's cool for them. Everyone's allowed to do what they want to do. It's not forced upon anybody. And so basically my job comes into, as a policy analyst, it's my job to keep a pulse on what the government does. So, for example, I have like a media scanner that gets sent to me every day, but I also subscribe to a plethora of newsletters that just keep an eye or just have like government announcements in them. And so I'm very updated in what the provincial government is doing. And then I know from the relationships I have with the nonprofit Indigenous housing providers, or AMA members, that they have goals for their community initiatives, right? Maybe I'm a youth policy analyst, so my role centers around that, right? So for example, a housing provider might say like, we've been serving people who have complex needs. They've been experiencing homelessness for a long time, and we wish to provide people housing before they find themselves experiencing homelessness. And so a preventative way to do that would be to go upstream, meaning like if this is like a 30-year-old person, then like upstream would be like an 18-year-old person. Okay, so now we want to house young people. And, as an Indigenous youth policy analyst and an Indigenous youth myself, I don't think it's rocket science to say that supporting young people and supporting adults is significantly different. Not only because they have different needs, they're going through developmental stages in their life, but also like we need to consider like safety standards and how Indigenous young people engage with the world, right? So, so there is like let me just give you an example. Like if I was serving a young person, I wouldn't want a 19-year-old or an 18-year-old in the same housing operation as a 29-year-old. I'm 27 and I was a completely different person at 19, okay? And like they're just different people, and that gap is just too much. So, so one of the things that a policy analyst would do would then identify what's the best cutoff age for somebody who is housing someone who's 19, and in British Columbia, that number is 24. Really based on on a lot of surveys from youth who have gone into some sort of housing operation. And I'll put it's actually called the Marginalized to Magnified report. I'll put that in the description as well, so you can look it up. You can just like Control F the number 24. Like I'm sure you'll find it pretty clearly in there. And so anyway, so like, basically like I'm a total content nerd. Like it's my job to know everything there is to know about Indigenous youth housing. And yeah, I should specify, I identify a youth as somebody between the ages of 11 to 18. I think there's a lot of other organizations that do it much differently. And, that's just that's one of the challenges in the youth sector. That's like, what do you mean by youth, right? And anyway, and then I would consider a young adult someone who's aged 19 to 28, or 29, sorry. And I mean, like 30, like you're still a young person, you know what I mean? Like I don't think you're like old, but it's just you're not like a young adult via programming acknowledgements and things like this. And so anyway, I think you can kind of get the perspective now that it's like my role as an Indigenous policy analyst is, I shouldn't say my role, my duties, tasks, responsibilities, like they're quite diversified. Like some days I'm writing grants for our membership. Some days I'm making submissions to the provincial government to inform some sort of thing they're making. Like for one time, the Ministry of Mental Health and Addiction in British Columbia was creating, or I think still is, creating an children and youth substance use and wellness framework. And so AMA made a submission to MMHA about the housing perspective of supporting a young Indigenous person who is experiencing substance use, right? And so it's our job to really kind of build out what that experience is like so that the people making the framework can include our input. And then ideally, as a policy analyst, I then look at that framework and I say, hey, government, it says here in your framework that you're going to do things this way. So you should do things this way and give us some money to do it because we're going to do a better job at it. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of like the whole thing, right? Like it's a long game. It's about putting in, it's about engaging government to include policy authority over how to operate an Indigenous youth response. That's kind of how I would like sum it up, you know what I mean? And that means like you can go so many which ways about like the duties that I do, right? One of the other things I do is I attend all sorts of committee meetings. So for example, like there's these things in British Columbia called the Situation Table, and basically it's like a way for policing to when policing isn't always the answer, right? So for example, like they'll have this table where they have like a bunch of stakeholders, usually from the nonprofit sector, from the government meaning like whatever ministry is related to that social challenge. So I'm a youth policy analyst. We have the Ministry of Children and Family Development at a lot of these committee meetings, or a liken to. But anyway, per the Situation Table, it's something that a police can essentially like move the case. You know what I mean? Like hey, this thing's happening, and we don't really have the means to support it, and so maybe we'll just recommend you folks figure it out. And they essentially like come up with like an immediate response, like a care plan within 24 to 48 hours. And I think it's a great initiative. And so myself, or I should say my organization, the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, they sit on the steering committee for that Situation Table in Vancouver. And so it's my job to bring that Indigenous experience and Indigenous youth experience, or young Indigenous people's experience, to that table, and just find ways for us to be creative about expressing the needs of the demographic while like securing just putting in that policy authority of like, hey, this is how we're going to operate this. If there's less Indigenous providers at the table than we would like, then it's my job to point that out and try to find a way, work with the team to include more Indigenous stakeholders. You know what I mean? Like, and anyway, you could quickly see how like my job is just kind of, it's like whatever you need me to do today, you know what I mean? But nonetheless, always in the context of policy, strategy development. And yeah, so That's my role. I definitely spent way more time on that than I expected, but I'm going to now unpack or just give a definition for what like a policy analyst actually is. And it's going to be from Indeed.com. My wife got me this mug, by the way. Anyway, so what is a policy analyst? Those working in policy analyst jobs examine different policies to determine if they are effective. These policies may include government policies, or they may be those of a private organization. Policy analysts conduct research to determine the benefits and challenges of a particular policy. They may also determine the public's opinion on a policy and consult with researchers and data analysts to gain more information about the impacts of different policies. In addition to recommending specific policies, policy analysts may change to policy drafts and suggest improvements to existing policies. So I feel like that's pretty straightforward, but I do want to point out that when we say policies, I think there's a very important distinction. I hope you're not hearing my Discord things go off right now. That's funny. But anyway, so the policies and procedures, I think, is kind of what we mostly think of when we say policy. So policy and procedure, in the context of housing, a policy might be that you need to be within the property at like 11 p.m. or something. Like they have a curfew, so we have a curfew policy, right? Or maybe the guest policy. Oh yeah, you can have guests, but only up to 2 weeks, and let us know if it's more than a week. That's just a policy, and that's a policy and procedure. Like it's a policy that leads to procedures, right? But my job, I work in public policy, meaning like when we think the public sector or the nonprofit sector. I don't know why I'm putting in quotes like as if these things don't exist, but anyway, in those sectors, it's my job to then analyze those kinds of policies, and it doesn't always mean like looking at big pieces of legislation and then like kind of like moving our way down. A lot of the work that I work at is actually like more on the ground responses. So for example, like there'll be a legislation like the Supportive Housing Agreement or something like that, or the Residential Tenancy Act. But there's like a whole bunch of responses and strategies and frameworks that have been developed from that piece of legislation. That's kind of what I focus on. It's not really like our goal as a housing association to analyze acts, like big pieces of legislation and find a way. Like, honestly, I feel like a lot of, this is kind of digressing, but I feel like a lot of acts are actually like very legal based. And like when you read them, it's not how a policy analyst would write, in my opinion. So it's just kind of one of those things, like you really do kind of need a lawyer to fully understand some acts, in my opinion. But anyway, I'm just kind of going off right now. So moving forward, I talked about how like policy analysts could span across like all different sectors. So here's like some different policy analyst titles. So you have a product policy analyst. So they might look at something, well, like if you're making physical products, then there's so many things that are related to that, like the way you're allowed to distribute, the way you're allowed to secure your materials, like all these different things that are like highly regulated. Like that's probably what a product policy analyst does. Government policy analyst, it depends on the ministry that they work in, but really a government policy analyst can be, a Ministry in Mental Health and Addiction policy analyst, or a Ministry of Children and Family Development policy analyst, or a housing policy analyst. But nonetheless not a housing policy analyst like me, you know what I mean? Like everything changes. Got safety policy analyst, I was kind of talking earlier or just a second ago about regulations and, are we doing this the right way? And then education policy analyst, the same thing. You have to teach in a certain way. Schools need to be developed in a certain way. There's always going to be a reason to have a policy analyst support those things. Occupational safety policy analyst, aviation policy analyst, and what I am is a social policy analyst. So let me give you the Indeed definition of what a social policy analyst is. So, social policy analysts use their knowledge of economics, law, sociology, and politics to assess and suggest new policies relating to social issues. These issues may include poverty, hunger, crime, decriminalization, disease, and unemployment. They may work for the government or consulting organization, Frayed Feathers, in completing research. They work to determine the cause of an issue or to understand if current policies are effective in achieving their goals. Social policy analysts suggest changes to policies and then use data to analyze their effectiveness. They may then present their findings in reports, newsletters, or books. Subscribe to the Frayed Feathers newsletter. It is in the description. Alrighty, so I kind of talked like all these points beforehand, but I just kind of want to go through them just because I wrote them down on my paper here. But basically, my job is to be a subject matter expert. I have an exhaustive understanding of Indigenous youth housing in British Columbia, kind of like the federal. I want to say like what the federal government is doing in the context of nonprofit Indigenous housing, and then really kind of like an extension of the Indigenous youth housing experience is also knowing about Indigenous youth reconciliation, because basically like all the things that happen for Indigenous people in the public sector, in my opinion, mostly consists around reconciliation. Like very rarely are people meaning like funders, developers, government institutions, I mean, they're all saying whenever they support an Indigenous project or anything, it's always like because, reconciliation is important and like these are our values and things like that. I'm not like saying that in like a knocking way, like that's just the reality. And so, yeah, it's very important for me as a policy analyst to understand that Indigenous youth reconciliation component of just policy, I guess, just like Canadian policy. And so anyway, I touched on this earlier. So like my deliverables are diverse. Sometimes I'm writing meeting briefs because I just have a lot of meetings, or I'm attending a lot of meetings with my leadership. Other times I create reports, submissions, presentations. I've delivered presentations all across the province. All with the goal, like all these presentations, submissions, committee meetings, briefs, all with the goal of securing money for our members. So I talked earlier about how like I keep a pulse on what the government's doing, and obviously I have relationships with nonprofit Indigenous housing providers, and so it's my job to kind of connect and align them about whatever sort of goals they have. So for example, maybe there's how would I say, like, so for example, like British Columbia just received like a bunch of money from the federal government about guns and gangs. And so basically it's like funding to like help preventing guns and gangs, which is a great thing. Guns and gangs can definitely be hurtful and all these things. But then it would be my job to maybe engage in some of those conversations and say like, yes, all these things you folks are doing are effective at preventing gun and gang violence. But, I think we should also consider that housing is a preventative measure to gun and gang violence, and then I would outline in a very fancy report with all these citations talking about the Indigenous youth experience in having a place to stay and having a home, a place to go with community, to then avoid loitering at the mall or the skate park or just whatever place that like young people loiter when they have no place to go, which become breeding, or I shouldn't say breeding grounds, but like become recruitment grounds for gangs, right? I mean, like you got nothing to do, no money to your name, nobody's looking out for you. Like, bro, like gangs look pretty good. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I'm saying this as somebody who decided to go another path when some of my friends decided to go that path. Like that's just. It's an experience that I empathize with. And anyway, so moving on to the next one. This is like what I think is like particularly valuable about being a policy analyst, and like why I want to do newsletters and like long form content, these podcasts and stuff, is because policy analysts are entry level positions, meaning they report to a manager. I have a manager, my manager has a director, yada, yada, yada. Basically, the point is we're entry level. We just got into the organization. And I would say that as an entry-level position, most of the times you're just doing whatever you're told to do. You know what I mean? Like, and I do too. but most of the time you're not like privy to much like leadership level discussions, or like maybe you get updates from your director or from your manager, depending on which kind of meetings your like organization has. Excuse me. But for me, as a policy analyst, being a subject matter expert, when our leadership requires information about my content, my subject matter, being Indigenous youth, then I get to like inform their decision. You know what I mean? And this might come in the form of like, just kind of gathering some stuff that I've already written. Maybe I have to research a little bit and then put some more, like develop some more writing. But nonetheless, like I come up with all this content. I write it in a way that is brief and like quick for them to read. And then I offer recommendations, you know what I mean? And most of the time, the recommendations that a policy analyst offers, are trusted, you know what I mean? And I mean, or they should be trusted. Like the longer you are a policy analyst and informing leadership's decisions, hopefully those decisions end up being good ones. And like the talking points you create for them are good ones and they look smart and, like all these good things. You're building trust with your leadership, right? So it's like, if I'm working for a year, maybe I've done some good things. Working for 2 years, I've like, maybe brought in some good relationships. And then maybe 3 years, I'm like refining the approach and like, some really good things have happened for the organization based on some, like the tip that we had kind of like started on or something like that. You know what I mean? And like, I'm not saying that and like policy analysts like freaking run the world, but I'm just saying like, informing leadership is very valuable. You know what I mean? Like you see big things happen when leadership makes decisions. And so anyway, you get to this point where, like you're not only informing their decisions, but then you're also engaging or being invited into the discussions with leadership, whether it be within your own organization or you're meeting with external stakeholders. I think I'm very privy as a policy analyst. Like my position is very external facing, meaning like I engage directly with government. I wouldn't say that like the main thing is to like inform my leadership so then they can only engage government. Like our policy team like engages government directly. And of course, anytime there's big decisions that need to be made, we bring in our leadership, right? Like I'm not spending no money or making big decisions like that. I'm just the nerd behind the desk. You know what I mean? Like I know the stuff, and so anyway, and so I feel like that is an incredibly valuable experience in the context of strategy development. Okay, because I get to see, and other policy analysts get to see how decisions are being made at the leadership level, not only in their own organization, but then also in government, like with other stakeholders, and like you're like engaging. If I'm engaging with director level people, meaning like entry, manager, then director. If I'm engaging with directors all the time, I'm going to learn a lot, and not a lot that I can like share because like, people have their own agendas and I don't want to like make anything harder for people or anything like that. But nonetheless, it helps me be smarter about where I push and pull our advocacy, right? And this is why I refer to policy analysts as like the like ultimate advocacy job, right? Because like I get to directly learn from the people making the decisions, but I also have no risk in the game. You know what I mean? Like I'm an entry level position. Obviously I try to do my job as best I possibly can, but like I'm really just witnessing the whole thing. Like as a policy analyst, I'm there to take notes. Like it's not my job to like talk a bunch and, say, oh, well, you really should spend your money this way. And no. Like, no, like absolutely not. And so anyway, and so the second part of, or maybe the third part of this podcast, what I want to talk about is how my role as a policy analyst changes at the different stages of a project. Okay, so let me give you some perspective as to like what kind of the timeline is, and I'll use the Aboriginal Housing Management Association like as a example to illustrate what I mean. Okay, so for me, so we have 4 departments. All right, we have a policy department, which is me. I would say like if we were to just boil it down to like number one thing, okay, my role is to secure money. Like I want to get money for the providers or the AMA members, and we do that through a variety of ways, like writing proposals, grants, showing up at the right place, having cool things to say, and people wanting to meet with us to do what we were thinking about and brainstorming, all kinds of stuff. Anyway, but if I was to secure money, through some miracle or something, then that money would go to a different team in the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, and they are called revitalizations. And so that team then works with the providers, the people who I was trying to secure money for, to actually operationalize it. You know what I mean? Like getting the agreements in, hiring the staff. If they're developing a building, then they're going to be providing some oversight there, some support as much as they can. All these different housing operations, say for example, you're supporting people using substance use, you want to have a safe injection site in your housing operation. Well, there's a lot of safety regulations and things that need to be in place for you to do that legally. And so that's what the revitalizations team does. They operationalize it. They get all the brick and mortar stuff, you know what I mean? Like they're making sure everything's in place, plus getting the staff and all this stuff. And then we have, once that operation, this substance support use housing operation becomes, operational, then it goes into housing operations, which is somebody who engages with the leadership consistently, and like they just kind of support them with like the day to day, someone broke a window. We got like, do you folks have any extra money for that? Here's our budget for the year. We'll send this to you so folks can do a budget review, give us our increases and stuff. Because remember, as I had mentioned, we have operational dollars that come from a Crown Corporation in BC Housing, and it comes down and down and down. And so it's our job at AMA to like work through those things, like all the money related things for those providers. And then lastly, which is like, okay, it's operational, you're supporting them ongoing. Like how the heck why would it not end, or why wouldn't it end there? And the reason is because we're always trying to increase the capacity of housing providers. We're always trying to make them better, right? Like we always want the best for the people we're serving. And the way you do that is constant and consistent improvements, whether they be incremental or large. And that's where our last team at AMA comes in, the training and evaluations teams. And that team really focuses on bringing more capacity, more training, more opportunities for free to nonprofit Indigenous housing providers so that they can offer different kinds of support, maybe offer better support, or I shouldn't say better, but like enhanced, you know what I mean? Like when you know more things, you're able to operate in a way that you get more from your inputs, right? And so anyway, the point is, like in all these different things, it's like you have like 4 teams doing 4 different things, but all for the same project, right? So it starts in policy, then it goes to revitalizations, then it goes to housing operations, then it's training and evaluation, okay? Here's the thing. At every point in that phase of the project, a policy analyst is useful. And it's my job to find ways to still be helpful in different contexts, right? So if you think about it, like in that description I just gave, I'm the policy person. It's my job to secure funding, right? But if that housing provider needs our support down the line, I'm still going to help them, like duh, right? So I then need to consider like how my previous role of just trying to secure funding, going to committees, writing submissions, writing grants for people, all these different things, that's not really relevant anymore. Like I don't have to write grants and submissions if I'm working directly with the leadership of a housing provider, or a housing provider's leadership. And so now my job mostly becomes a facilitator. Like it's my job to connect the housing provider's needs or balance their business goals with Indigenous values and engage government about whatever it might be, right? So for example, like say a housing provider's like, hey, we want to better support our youth. We would like to have this kind of programming, which would mean we need to secure funding, but you're not in the phase, but I am not in the context now of like writing committee or like attending committees and all these things. I'm now working directly with the provider and working directly with the government. Okay. So I've done this more than a few times now, this dynamic. And basically, the reason why I feel like my job becomes less of a policy analyst and more of a collaborator is because really I'm balancing the perspectives and aligning the goals, like by writing, like a report. But really, it comes down to solving the collaboration challenges between the housing provider and the government. Okay, so like I don't want to get too much into examples because like I don't want to like allude to a certain stakeholder like not doing a very good job or something. But basically, there's been times where I've created responses, indigenous responses, like a strategy, a framework, whatever it might be. And I'll engage with a let's say a government ministry or a crown corporation, and basically the person that I sent it to, they probably read it. You know what I mean? Like they're like, oh, I'm going to connect all these different people into it. Let's talk about this more. Cool. Thinks that sounds awesome to me. Get to the meeting. Actually, nobody's read it except for the person who brought you here. They didn't brief anybody. They just decided to invite them into a meeting. And now you're sitting there with a 15-page document that is highly detailed and has a budget included, and nobody here knows what the heck you're talking about, and you only have an hour. Like, that's what I'm talking about. Like quickly it becomes, okay, how can I make this hour useful with all these people who have no idea what the heck I'm talking about right now? Okay. And so anyway, like, at the base of all these like responses, right? The strategies, the frameworks, it's about they're created by collecting perspectives and weighing all decisions. Okay. So like you've already done a hella collaboration trying to get everybody to align with this strategy. But now you're taking the strategy to the people who will actually fund it, and they have no idea what the heck is going on. And so it's so frustrating. And so anyway, what I discovered through this frustrating experience, it happened many times, and I'm not going to mention specifics because it'll definitely give things away. But basically, I started to take facilitation very seriously. I've been facilitating since I was 15 years old. I'm 27 now. That's 13 years of experience. I started as a dance teacher. I facilitate beatbox workshops. Of course, being a social worker, group dynamics, facilitating circles, community circles, debriefing circles, all these kinds of things. And also community council, like the actual, like the program I used to work in at the Aboriginal Legal Services in Toronto. Check out my LinkedIn. They open up we intake people through a community council circle. And so basically I'm just very familiar with facilitation, not only in the context of like supporting people with their artistic expression, and like beatbox, like, but also taking people's very serious needs, people who are vulnerable, maybe in states of crisis, and kind of working with them to align their expectations with their goals, and just kind of supporting them through that very interpersonal relationship, I guess, and process. And so anyway, like, I developed a lot of soft skills over the years, and I'm very happy with that. Like the best way I would kind of like wrap it all up is like, like when somebody tells me that, oh, I talked to this person and like they didn't really like this, or they thought it was stupid, or like I couldn't get through to them, my brain almost always goes, okay, but they haven't talked to me about it yet. And I don't mean that like I'm so freaking cool, but it's a recognition of skill. Like I've been doing this for 13 years, like, yeah, sure, you think teaching dance, oh, cool, you get in front of a room and, yada, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And that's part of it. But there's also a part of it where you're working with kids, working with young adults, working with teenagers. and there's egos involved. Like people are expressing themselves artistically, and there's a lot of emotion that goes into that, a lot of passion. And there's sometimes that people piss each other off, and like it's my job as a dance teacher to like work with them. You know what I mean? Like, hey y'all, like let's figure something out here. Like, like we don't have to do this and that, whatever. Like, let's do this in a good way. And then also like getting results with all those different groups, right? Like, why are we doing anything if we're not trying to get results, right? And so anyway, now I started taking strategy development facilitation very seriously. Like I've spent 10 grand in training over the last year. I've been part of a coaching community in AJ and Smart for I think about 7 or 8 months now. And I learned so much. Like I've consumed over like 150 hours of their content. I'm always refining my approach. And really what I feel like I'm seeing is a incredible difference in the effectiveness of my policy analyst job, because like when I'm able to enter a meeting where everybody's aligned because I've like done all this extra facilitation work, then my policy or my strategy that I'm putting forward is going to have a significantly higher success rate. And so that's kind of where I'm moving towards with Frayed Feathers. I really feel like there's a need to have strong facilitators for Indigenous responses, like for just Indigenous led projects. But nonprofit, there's kind of like, there's never enough money to go around in nonprofit, right? Like money and funding is always like the main scarcity and the main barrier to like a community response or something like this. And I'm about to burp again. Excuse me. Sip this. And so anyway, it's like when you tell somebody like, hey, I would like to be a facilitator for all your meetings and, it's going to be this much money. They're like, I don't have that kind of money for a facilitator. I can run meetings. But here's the thing, like, if you've ever been in a strategy development meeting, like, like those things just spawn different meetings. Okay. Like you put up an agenda, 4 hours goes by. We still got 2 agenda items that we never even touched. And only like the loudest speakers in the room are being able to speak. Only the people who have the most, public speaking prowess are the ones who feel comfortable to engage. Like if you think of it like a glacier, you know what I mean? Like, a meek person who's very quiet might actually have the answer, but they're at the bottom of the glacier. And like the level of discussion is only what's happening above the waterline. You know what I mean? Like there's so many valuable opinions under the water that the format of a regular meeting in the context, meaning like, somebody shows up, hey guys, this is our challenge here today, let's talk about it. What do you think about XYZ thing? There's a lot of people who will just never talk in those kinds of meetings. Like it's just not them. That's not how they engage. And maybe, and like honestly, I don't think that those people should be forced to like learn how to public speak and all these things. Like public speaking's great, obviously I like to hear myself talk, like hence having a podcast, but like not everybody's like that, and I shouldn't be expecting people to be like that. And so basically I facilitate in a way that doesn't require people to engage directly. I actually don't have many people talking while I'm facilitating. And yeah, it really just kind of comes down to recognizing the skill sets in the room and finding ways to get everybody's valuable opinions out into the world, essentially, right? So, like when we engage in these types of meetings where we're just talking for an hour, maybe 2 hours, like it's really hard to remember everything that happened in that meeting. And it's my job as the note taker to make sure people, to make sure we have a record of it. But, like almost every time I write a briefing for somebody, like they're like, oh yeah, all that stuff happened. Yeah, for sure. You know what I mean? Like we remember, I think it's called the serial principal phenomenon. It's like, when we have meetings, we remember like one thing and then the peak, like our favorite thing about it and then the peak of that meeting. Or no, sorry, we remember the peak, which is the favorite thing that we have, and they remember the ending. And so anyway, like just knowing all these like little tips and tricks, and like just understanding the experience of like how hard it is to digest a whole hour of talking, and also recognizing that not everybody's that's not everybody's strength. You know, like we can then operate our meetings in a way that circumvents all those challenges, or even better, finds a solution to these challenges, right? And so I'm not going to go into like all the different tactics, because I think that that's more like a different meeting. But what I'm trying to say is that I spent like 10 grand and like over 200 hours of my life just to learn how to better facilitate meetings that get results. And what I'm realizing is that as a policy analyst, that's kind of what I do. Like I have meetings with people to get results, because meetings are a place where all decisions are made, and when decisions are made, big things happen. So we need meetings. Meetings need to happen, despite them sucking sometimes. And so I'm just realizing that, like, over the 13 years that I've developed all these soft skills, like, not only like, the general facilitation things, but also just being a social worker. Like, I feel like social workers have like a very deep understanding of interpersonal communication and group dynamics, and like supporting somebody in like a vulnerable state in their life. Like, nothing is like that. Like, of course, I recognize people like are like the rock to like their family members and things like this, but like doing something, but like supporting somebody in distress who's a stranger, like you learn so much things, not only about them, but also yourself. And like, I would definitely be lying if I said I didn't fall on my face sometimes, but like I've learned. And anyway, so now taking these skills and looking at policy and like basically like strategy development and like funding, all these things that are like very complex projects. Complex meaning like maybe there's over 30 people working on it, maybe there's 100 people working on it. Like a lot of the like challenges and things that come into these meetings are really kind of based around insecurities. Like they're just people being people, right? And so like it's very easy for me as somebody who had to support people who may not want to tell me about their emotions, but it's my job to like unpack it with them and like make sure they feel good, and building care plans for them. I feel like I can do that pretty quickly in these high level strategy developments. You know what I mean? Like I can see what is bothering people, and we can kind of unpack it and make them feel better. And then like, then our strategy gets better because we no longer have this blockade of somebody, making our life difficult. And anyway, so like, this is why I started Frayed Feathers, because I feel like I'm a good policy analyst. Like I try my best, like I'm always trying to do extra things like to increase my capacity as a policy analyst. And I feel like I've done some good things for the organization I work for. But really, like, I think like I just enjoy facilitating, you know what I mean? And like knowing what I know, like, referring to, like informing leadership, being privy to like leadership level discussions, decision making, and just like how government operates, you know what I mean? There's been a lot of times where I've been like, oh, okay, so that's how it is. You know what I mean? Now I can bring that perspective to people who are in the same field and creating these responses, but then I can offer my expertise as a facilitator to make sure that their project goes very smoothly, right? Because I think what I witness a lot, I don't want to say like it's all the time, but like a lot, is nonprofit folks, whether they be a coalition, an organization, a committee, whatever it might be, they'll write their minister a letter and they'll say, hey, we got this cool thing we're doing. We know that from the minister letter that you're supposed to be doing X thing. We would love to meet with you to learn how we can engage, all this and that, whatever. But what they don't know, or not considering perhaps, is that leadership in theory can understand very complex social challenges, right? Like, I would hope that the Ministry of Children and Family Development could understand a complex report about children and family development, right? Like, or young people, whatever it might be. But they are so busy, okay? Like I don't, like, unless people have worked with leadership, like a director or above, like, it's astonishing, like, how busy they are with meetings. And so, yes, in theory, they can understand a very complex thing. But in practice, you have to write it in a brief, and like, I know this as a policy analyst, like, I was writing things that were complex and, like, gave the full picture and all these things. But my leadership was like, I can't read it all. Plus, like, it's really hard to, like, develop talking points from, like, a very complex paragraph, right? And so, what I learned is it takes effort to be brief, to, like, take a complex idea and write it in a way that is simple and easy for people to understand, and, like, don't need me to tell them anything. They just look at the paper and they're like, oh, okay, cool, I get it. And so what happens, unfortunately, for our coalition or nonprofit, whatever, they finally get the meeting, like, months and months later. And, like, maybe the minister brought, like, a director or something with them. And, that minister is now, like, 3 months into, like, a project, that they've been allocated to do. And really what the minister wants to meet about is, like, how can we engage your work, your team, your coalition into the work that we're doing. But the coalition is like, we sent an email or a letter to you about this thing 3 months ago, and this is what we want to do, and this is our experience. And, like, the minister's not briefed on, like, anything that was in the letter. They don't have, I shouldn't say they weren't briefed, but, like, let's say they don't have the talking points to discuss the very specific things that are in that letter. And then it's just incredibly disheartening. You know what I mean? But what I've realized as a policy analyst, I can take that minister letter, break it up into pieces, engage directly with the minister's team before the meeting, get everybody aligned on what the project and what the ideal results are for it, setting expectations with them and them for us, and then, like, just kind of bringing all that information back to the coalition or whatever, and just being like, hey, these are all the people in the room. Like, these are the people who have decision-making power, and these are their communication channels. And, like, this is how I think you folks should go about this. And then I'll, and that's, like, kind of the consultancy part of it, the policy analyst vibe, like, I can do all these different things for you. But then in the actual meeting, I've engaged with all these people. I know what the results are, or what the results need to be, and I can now create a session, like, whether it be facilitated exercises or just sequence discussion, to get the results that the coalition wants. And I think that that's invaluable. You know what I mean? Like, the way I've been describing it is kind of like, I'm the person to give you, like, the best 10%, first 10% of your project. You know what I mean? Like, I want to set it up in a way that everybody's aligned, and, like, moving forward, like, there's a very clear terms of reference and framework, and, like, how we're going to do these things, and just making sure that the whatever person or company or team is making the Indigenous response operates in a way to get them results with government. That's really what Frayed Feathers is. It's about solving collaboration challenges for teams who are creating Indigenous responses. And most of those Indigenous responses have some sort of connection to government, right? And so that's why I feel like I'm in a perfect position to engage both of these sectors and find ways to just make everything better for them. So that is the end of the podcast. Thank you for coming and hearing me out. I will definitely be doing this again. I'm planning on doing another one next Tuesday. And so I want to be consistent about this every Tuesday. I'm probably going to keep this format, like, just kind of like talking. In the past, I kind of had this idea of, like, I want it to be super informative and researched, and like I'm gonna show like things on the screen and then talk about them, and like honestly, bro, like I'm just gonna get after it. You know what I mean? Like I'm just gonna talk about the things that I want to talk about, and they're always gonna be in the context of Indigenous youth reconciliation and like the things that surround them. But yeah, like I like the free flow. I like the just having some talking points, then just kind of talking. Like I wrote a bunch of notes here, but like what I'm realizing is like I said a bunch of the notes that are like 2/3 in, like at the top, and I said some of them at the bottom. Some of them I didn't even say. And yeah, but nonetheless, I felt like it was a good podcast. So miigwech, y'all. Peace out. Appreciate you. Hit up this newsletter down below. It's going to be launching November 4th. That's it. Peace.